So let's continue for a bit the question, the discussion of modes of transportation before and on Shabbat. So, but and then that is a part of, I think, of a larger discussion that always has to be taken into account, and that is the spirit of Shabbat, the the way the way Shabbat feels for you. And the caveat here is that the spirit of Shabbat is cannot be defined by the rabbinate, cannot be defined by a governing body that dictates what Shabbat means for people, because it there are so many different circumstances that we cannot. I would not have considered unless someone would have told me that I went through this experience. Um, So with just one example, when I wrote a while ago about um, autonomous vehicles on Shabbat, voice-activated autonomous vehicles, a friend of mine, an Orthodox rabbi who lives in Winnipeg, wrote back to me, he said, I would never have thought that I would say this, but living in Winnipeg, I think now that this would be the only way, if that comes out, that would be the only way for people to travel to the synagogue. So just because of the cold weather. Another example. So going back to the idea of the spirit of Shabbat, what I mean is that the there was always a tendency among the rabbinic leadership to issue blanket statements, usually prohibitions of saying you cannot do this. And they were protective in nature. We want to protect the community to make sure that people don't do something which is wrong. The problem with that is that people do not know the parameters. It's important to say what is right, what is wrong, what is allowed technically by halakha and what is not, and then let people decide how they're going to choose it, and hopefully they will use it correctly. We have to give credit to the people. So many years ago, I think I mentioned that I had a discussion with someone asking me about cars on Shabbat. Why can't you drive on Shabbat? And I said that the discussion is not focused on the right on the right element of the problem, because the rabbis focused on the mechanical aspect of driving and of the car, and of the combustion engine and exactly what is done there. And when you open the door, the lights go on, etc., etc. Where the real problem is the mobility on Shabbat. And how do you want to see your Shabbat? Do you want to be, some people feel confined on Shabbat and they feel trapped, which is not good, but it doesn't really mean that if you go out and you drive and you could go wherever you want, that you're free, because that in many cases that freedom is really slavery. Because if you can drive on Shabbat, then all your errands maybe will be done on Shabbat. Taking the car to the body shop will be on Shabbat. The office, and being, especially if when I lived in LA, they thinking of someone who goes on the road on Shabbat to sit on the 405 for 3 hours. You could do Kiddush and Havdalah on the road. So it's really, but so that is a problem. On one hand, you convey to people that maybe that's not what you want to do on Shabbat. On the other hand, when you have a situation of not life-threatening emergency, but great necessity, people should know what is allowed, what is not. I've heard of cases of people who drove into a dangerous neighborhood on their way to their destination on Shabbat, left the car and walked a couple of miles in dangerous conditions, and they really risked their lives. Or one story that I read is about a Rabbi who took his students on a trip for Shabbaton in the East Coast. Not a very smart move on a short Friday in February, and they got stuck in a snowstorm. They all got off the bus and walked for a couple of hours until a miracle they found a place where they could stay, and they did not die. Now that's not a miracle. That's utter stupidity and irresponsibility. the trip should not have been scheduled for that Friday. And once they were on the road, they were not supposed to leave the bus under these conditions. If they could call a crew to save them or keep driving, that's what they should have done. Even if the driver is Jewish, it's not about Jewish, non-Jewish, just potential threat to life. So back to this question of the car. When the question was raised 20 years ago, I thought the next thing would be solar cars that would be operable on Shabbat. Now we're getting into the realm of electric cars that could be fully voice operated or autonomous. And it's coming. In Pittsburgh, they already have a part of the city where autonomous cars are traveling around. And this probably is something we're going to see within 10 years, where large cities or advanced cities would seal off certain parts of the city and will allow only public autonomous vehicles to go there. So if that is the case, and you go out and a bus or a car could stop by your house and take you to the shul, what are people going to do, and how does it affect your Shabbat experience? So that is really where the discussion should be, not only with transportation, but with all of the changes that we're going through with technology. It's the balance between maintaining the spirit and the experience that we have with Shabbat, and on the other hand, not getting stuck in situations which are either physically stressful or emotionally or religiously stressful. So this is a very fine balance that it's not easy to attain. So when we talk about modes of transportation, before Shabbat, during Shabbat, we spoke last times because we're talking about Siman Resh Mem Zayin in Shulchan Aruch, which speaks about traveling before Shabbat. So we spoke about those activities that start before and enter Shabbat, and we spoke about being on an airplane, being on a train, etc. Maybe that's here is also a good opportunity to speak about transportation on Shabbat in general. Let's start from, let's say, Me'akal el Kaved, from the lesser problem to the bigger problem. So, walking by foot, not a problem. Riding an animal is a rabbinical prohibition. The rabbis tied it to the prohibition, to a decree that you might break a branch to hit the animal, and then you will be transgressing a biblical prohibition. So it's really a rabbinical prohibition. Today, people don't ride horses to get from one place to another. It's just recreational. I think that most people, when we're talking about transportation, most people, if we as observant people, do not need to ride horses on Shabbat. I wonder if I'm thinking about a situation where someone maybe needs it for therapeutic reasons and he has to do it regularly. I think they could pass one day. We could survive. But again, we don't use it as modes of transportation today. Now, the next level is that those modes of transportation that are operated by human power only, not electric or gas or anything like that. So what do we have? We have rollerblades, roller skates, skateboards, bicycle. Anything else I forgot that people could get from one place to another on land? I think that's it, right? So skateboard, rollerblade, and skateboards. The rollerblades, roller skates, and skateboards. If you know how to operate them, and you know you're not going to break something, good for you. You could use it on Shabbat. My friend Chabad Rabbi in LA used to come from place to place on rollerblades. Something that you can't do it because you're digging, you're making a mark on the floor. Complete nonsense. Because if that is the problem, you can't even walk. When you walk, and especially if you have any letters embedded on your soles, you're not only digging, you're writing. So that's classic example, Yosef, of davar shelo mitkaven. That is not your intention, and that's not what you want to do. Bicycle is a little more problematic. but it's only problematic because people want to make it problematic. Um, the famous there is a famous, I believe it is famous, ruling by the Ben Ish Hai. Oh, Michael is commenting that everybody's using scooters in Miami Beach. Thank you. I forgot about that. In Lakewood, I was actually surprised to see that the Orthodox community people use the children use scooters on Shabbat. It became acceptable. Um, bicycle. The Rabbi Yosef Haim of Baghdad ruled. Daniel and Michelle, thank you. Raf Pe'alim. He ruled as a response to a question that came no less from India. They asked about it's called gari in India, and they asked him, could you use it on Shabbat? The Ben Ish Hai, Rabbi Yosef Haim, analyzed the problem, and he said there's no problem at all. And we'll go back later to say why he said it is not a problem. But of course, very quickly people objected this, and they said it is a problem. Their main issue was with the risk of the bicycle breaking on Shabbat, and you are fixing them. The Ben Ish Hai actually thought of that, and he responded to that by saying that this would be a decree to prevent the use of bicycle because something might happen to them, and then I might do something wrong. This falls under the category of decree. This is the kind of rabbinical decree when they say, don't do this because it might lead to that. And he says, we don't have the authority to legislate new decrees after the period of the Talmud. Now, since that argument didn't work, people tried to undermine the authority of decrees gezerah. The attempt was to make the Ben Ish Hai ruling somehow invalid. So that was done with in two ways. One is that people argued that the Ben Ish Hai referred to the solid tire and not to the inflatable tire. That could be solved in a very simple way. You look up the date of the teshuvah, and you look up the date of the invention of the inflatable tire, and then you know what the Ben Ish Hai was talking about. That was done, and that was confirmed that when Ben Ish Hai wrote the teshuvah, and definitely when he passed away, the inflatable tire was already in place. So the argument that if it deflates, you have to, or if there's a puncture and you fix it on Shabbat, it's a problem. He was already aware of that. The other argument, which is I think a little more vicious, was that the Ben Ish Hai changed his mind. The argument was made that Rabbi Yosef Haim, shortly before he passed away, changed his mind, but he didn't have time to publicize his opinion. So this is discussed by Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who completely rejects it, even though eventually he says not to ride bicycle on Shabbat for a different reason. The reason Rabbi Ovadia Yosef rejects this argument is that he says a posek, a halachic decisor, an authority of the caliber of the Ben Ish Hai would, if he really changed his mind, he would have made anything within his power to make sure that people know that he changed his mind. As I discussed with Jacob this Shabbat, Jacob Mark happened to be with us. It was a wonderful Shabbat, and I said even if he had the last breath before he died, the Ben Ish Hai would have said no bike, right? Would try to convey to people. He didn't do it, so there's no reason to believe that he changed his mind. The interesting thing is that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says, don't ride a bike on Shabbat. Why? Because it already became a practice not to. It's a minhag. So, fast forward, what is the practice today? in most Ashkenazi communities, I believe the practice is not to ride bicycle on Shabbat. In Los Angeles, when I lived there, I saw that the Kabbalah Center has instituted a new minhag, the Shabbat bicycle carpool, which is the kind of bicycle that you sometimes see in amusement parks. It's a 6-seater or an 8-seater, and everybody rides it together from shul. It's all mechanical, no electric or gas power. But the last person who's there and have to bike this heavy contraption home is should really be in good shape. This is in that's what I saw in LA, in Deal, where in Deal and in Brooklyn, among the Syrian community, it is very common to see people on bicycle on Shabbat. And actually it sort of divides the community into two parties: the bikers and the non-bikers. Now, I had an interesting discussion with some people from the community a couple of years ago. I wrote an article explaining why you could ride bicycle on Shabbat, why it is permissible, even though my wife still doesn't allow me to do that. I have to abide by her rules. That's her Shulchan Aruch. Like I listen to her. So I explain why it is permissible. Now, most of the Syrian community pretends, people believe that they follow the rulings of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. So someone wrote an article back saying, attacking very, harshly, saying that this is not true, that you cannot ride bicycle on Shabbat. But when he was pressed for explanation, he said, we cannot ride bike on Shabbat because we are passing through neighborhoods where Ashkenazi Jews live, and they don't have this practice, and it looks awkward. So first, that would mean that if you bike in Deal where everybody's Syrian, it's okay. But my argument was, to him at least, I said that if you want, and I didn't say it specifically about him, I said in general, if you claim, which is he said that he adheres to the rulings of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef did not say it's forbidden. It says it's not the practice, right? But I said even if you want to keep that as a minhag, you could only do that if you follow all the rulings of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. So what I suggested to people was, if your rabbi insists on following a certain ruling based on the rulings of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, please check with him if his wife wears a wig or covers her hair with a head, because Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is against women wearing a wig. I know that the rabbi's wife wears a wig, so how can you pick and choose just to do that? Anyway, following that article, I had a discussion with a couple of people, and someone said, you know what, I'm actually very happy that Rabbi Ovadia put out this article saying that you could ride bicycle on Shabbat and the halachic reasons, because now I'm not embarrassed when I ride my bike. I could ride with my head raised. And then someone told him, and that was really, I think it's very telling, and one of the problems that we have when we try to apply modern rulings and adjust to changing circumstances. That person told him, no, you should still feel embarrassed. You should still put your head down. And then he says, I also ride bicycle on Shabbat, but you should know it is forbidden. And I was flabbergasted. Why would you want to be a transgressor in your mind? And it's as if he says, I want there to be a certain gold standard for the community. If I cannot do it, it's okay, it's a problem, but at least we know that at least the rabbi keeps the halacha for us. So that is a problem that we have. Now, there is a problem. Now let's talk about modern bicycle and know what could happen with them. So first of all, modern bicycle could carry a lot of equipment, and some of it could be electric or electronic lights that are. So you could make sure that You don't use any electricity on the bike on Shabbat. The question is about carrying. So there's carrying, there's Tchum, and what if it breaks down? What do you do? So riding out of the home is not a problem because you're not walking out of it. You're rolling out of the home. Preferably not. But Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says you do it only for a mitzvah. The Ben Ish Chai says for a mitzvah you could do it, and you could ride even when there's no eruv because it is not called carrying; it's called gilgul. So you could do it. It's just rolling. So I spoke about equipment. This. What if the bike breaks down? So there are two classic situations of breakdown, and then maybe more complicated ones. The most common one, at least to me, tell me if I'm wrong, is when the chain falls off, right? That's annoying. What do? You put it back on. Now, can you do it on Shabbat or not? The answer is yes, you could do it on Shabbat. Why? Because it's going to fall again. It's not, you're not fixing anything. You're just, it's just like playing with Lego. You put it together, you'll take it apart. You're folding a chair, you'll unfold the chair. The same thing with the chain, no permanent fixing. What about air? If you have a deflated tire, you have a punctured tire, you could pump air into it. Why is that? This is something that actually Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says, even though he's not in favor of riding bicycle on Shabbat, but he says when he speaks about inflating a ball or a balloon on Shabbat, he says it's not a problem of reinflating a balloon or a ball. It's not fixing. Why is it not fixing? He says because all the air in the world is connected. So the air moved from inside outside and you put it back in. There's no problem. So it's brilliant. You could do the same thing with a tire. If the bike breaks down in a way that is really not operable on Shabbat, hopefully you have a chain on the bike. You chain it where it is, and that's where you might run into a problem. If you have a really expensive bicycle that in the range of a couple of $1,000s and up, you might not want to separate yourself from it on Shabbat, and therefore the only solution would be to sit next to it until Shabbat is over, and then take it back home. Someone call it. Michael asked if it's not shaping. It's not. There's no particular prohibition about shaping unless you're taking you make a combination of liquid and solid material like sand and water or something like megabel, and is also secondary. But here it's definitely not shaping because the shape is there. The air is not changing the shape of the tire. Yes, Gilgul. Gilgul is mentioned, and it's a the idea of Gilgul is that it's not carrying on Shabbat. And this again, if we go back to Deal, I'll tell you the story that happened there. So, first of all, let me answer Ben's question. Yes, there is a danger that one will carry a broken bike where there's no eruv. It is possible, but that falls under the statement of the Ben Ish Chai that we don't make new decrees, because then we could always run into trouble. Also, there's another possibility if you really a serious biker and you want to do that and you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. There's an unbreakable bike. I think it's called Genesis. I mean, the last time I saw it was a couple of years ago. But you could Google unbreakable bike. The chain doesn't fall. I don't know what with the tires. That could be a good solution for Shabbat. The Ben Ish Chai says that if you go for a mitzvah, you could go even when there's no eruv. And as we saw in the previous simanim, the definition of dvar mitzvah is flexible. So you could argue that if you go to visit a relative, to have Ornik Shabbat, etc., it's okay. Now, about the gilgul of bicycle or agalot in general, the when I lived in Deal in New Jersey, there was an Eruv war. The local rabbis did not want to make an eruv for the city, especially a couple of cities. It's Deal, Elbron, Oakhurst, all little towns that are connected to each other. Um, the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was very well connected with the rabbis of Deal, New Jersey, and he kept pressing them to do an eruv. They were holding back, and why they were holding back? Because of an idea that we started talking about in the beginning of this class, and that is the spirit of Shabbat. They felt that if they will establish an eruv, people will not only ride their bike, but also have basketball tournaments and stuff like that, and go to the beach. So they wanted to control the community. The problem was the people did it anyway, and the eruv would have helped people who are shomer Shabbat, who are concerned about their eruv, to let them carry as they wish. So eventually they did that. But when they did that, they published a booklet explaining to everyone how to use the eruv, and basically said that if you want to be a truly Shabbat observant Jew, you should not rely on the eruv anything, not even to take a stroller out of your house. As we'll see when we get to the laws of eruv, this is really, I would say, not a true statement, because even if they argue that in the past their community did not use an eruv, the city of Deal, even in the summer, is still a resort town. It's a small town. You don't have a volume of 600,000 people going in the street and wide streets as required by halacha. So the eruv should really work for them. But at the time, I lived there. I knew the rabbi who published the book. I approached him and I said, at least I don't want to refute what you wrote, but at least one detail should be changed, and that is strollers, because that is the one of the main obstacles for Shomer Shabbat families who also are concerned about eruv, is that they cannot take their kids to the synagogue. If you have children, you want to push a stroller. So I showed him the argument in Shulchan Aruch in Rav Pe'alim about wheeling something that is called gilgul and rolling and not carrying and should be allowed. And thank God they corrected it in the booklet before it was published. So that would be the story of the bicycle. If maybe for some people it should not be used on Shabbat. Depends on how you feel about that, and maybe we should push for people to do it. I think I mentioned to someone, to Jacob, but that a simple solution would be, if you want to ride bicycle on Shabbat and you want to avoid controversy, is to attach a flag or a little banner to your bicycle that says Shabbat bicycle. And on the other hand, you say approved by Rabbi Yosef Haim of Baghdad. Maybe put a picture of his, because he's really, has this dignified, very respectable. No, it's really, this is the way you make people understand that this is okay. If anyone wants to start a business, make those flags, sell them online, and donate the money to buy a bicycle for the someone in Israel. I don't know. Okay. What else? What else could be human powered? Besides, what is this? Pogo sticks. I don't think you should use them on Shabbat. Okay. So the next step is all motorized vehicles. So motorized vehicles, the concession of most of all the poskim, I think, is that it is considered because it's combustion engine, it's burning, it's starting a fire. You should not use it on Shabbat. However, there's room to be lenient when you're not driving it, someone else is driving it, a non-Jew, to say that it is not directly a biblical prohibition. And this is only for cases of emergency, not life-threatening emergency, but something that might fall in between. And I'll give you an example in a second. Someone else is driving it. What is the full scope of the prohibition? There is a combustion engine. There is a inner burning that happens in the engine, but the whole thing starts with the spark, which is an electric spark, and an electric spark is not a biblical to produce. Is not a biblical prohibition. It would lead to something that it would be considered a biblical prohibition. So of course, one should not do that on Shabbat. But if there is a necessity and someone is already there who could drive you, and I would argue that in some cases, even if it's a Jew and that Jew is driving anyway, you could join if necessary. And I'll give you the case in question. And I mentioned in the previous class, just before this one, I've been teaching on kashrut, and we were analyzing an amazing teshuvah of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein about parents in Moscow, in Russia of the 1934, whose children were communist atheists, but the parents could not sustain themselves because of the economic system in Russia at the time. They had to rely on their children to feed them. And the question was, could they rely on the promise of their children that they're only going to serve them kosher food? Rabbi Feinstein, deliberates on the question, and he finally says, yes. He says, you could rely on the love that the children have for their parents, that they will treat them with dignity and will not cause them to sin. And someone was surprised by that kind of lenient response of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And my explanation to that was, this is what happens when the rabbi lives with the people and he knows what's going on. And I think for that reason, Rabbi Feinstein says in the opening of his discussion, when I visited Moscow in 1934, he wants to let you know, I was there, I understand what people were going through. So I'm saying that because when you deal with people, you get questions from people, you have the correspondence and the dialogue that's ongoing, you realize there are so many different situations that cannot have been anticipated by the legislator who writes a technical manual from his study. So that is one of those incidents that I would not have could not have thought of, but came to my door, and I had to answer on the spot, and that's what I did. So this was the case. I lived in the LA at the time, and a neighbor came to me. He belonged to the Young Israel Synagogue, and he came to me because his father was my congregant, and he knew me. Turns out that his father had a stroke a couple of days earlier while driving, and thank God he felt that something was wrong, and he was able to pull off, and he got to the hospital, but he was in critical condition. That was 3 days after it happened on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. He was in the hospital, and the man's sister got a message. The man's sister, who's not who is not a Shomer Shabbat in that sense, she drives on Shabbat, uses her phone. She got a message from the hospital that her brother might not survive till the morning, and the hospital was far away from where the son lived. He would not be able to make it there walking on Shabbat, and it wasn't even until the morning. They said maybe within the hour he's going to die. So the son really wanted to go see his father in the hospital. He ran to his rabbi's house. The rabbi said, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know if you could go. He wanted to know if he could take a cab. Rabbi said, I don't know. Why? Because it's not a life-threatening situation. Your life is not in danger. And he came to me, and I asked him, where would you be if your father died and you wouldn't be at his side? Which I happen to know because it happened to my wife. She missed her flight and couldn't be there. She came after her father passed away. So he said that this would haunt him his whole life. And so I said here, because the concept of kibbud avayim is important, and because of the emotional strife that he's going to suffer his whole life, is going to change his perspective on Judaism and on his life, and really diminish his quality of life in a tremendous way. And since the prohibition that is involved is only a rabbinical, you could limit a rabbinical prohibition because it starts with the spark and then leads to the engine, even though lechatchila we don't want to do it deliberately. I said, yeah, you could take a cab and go see your father. He said, and then he told me, after we had this discussion, he said, my aunt is waiting outside in the car. Can I go with her? So I said, yes, go with her. And the reason was because she was going anyway. It doesn't matter if he was in the car or was not in the car. He's not the one who's sanctioning her actions. Maybe if, I didn't get to this situation. Maybe if a Jew would have offered to take him, I would say no. I would say take an Uber, take a cab. That's better. But she was already waiting. She was going anyway. Thank God his father survived. But it was really for him life-changing that he was able to go. And that's an example of where you need to know the rules and the parameters for Pesika, because you'll need them handy. It's not always that you could pick up a phone and call. So I'm going to conclude here because I have another class tonight. Tonight is a busy night. But I'll tell you this, that before we go, that remember when we started doing the Smicha program, I said I hope that we can build into something which is even more structured than what we're doing now. And thank God this is happening. A couple of friends got together here in Maryland, and I'm working also with my friends in Brooklyn, hopefully with you guys as well, when I put the program out to God willing in September, if we can manage maybe a little later, to make this Torah ve'Ahava into a sort of an online university where we're going to have hopefully 2 daily classes that are going to be built into courses. You could log in, you could take them at your ease, do evaluations, and we'll give, we're not credited yet, hopefully will be, but people will be able to get diplomas for completing certain courses. Hopefully it will grow more and more because that kind of learning that is done with the community, with learning people from everywhere is really catching up, and people like doing that. So I'll keep you posted. So thank you all for being part of that, and B'ezrat Hashem, I'll see you next week. I'm still online. If you want to ask questions, I'm just stopping the recording.